So with those words, I want to open up the evening and ask you, Leslé, to introduce yourself and tell us how you came to write this beautiful body of work. And if anything was silencing you, how you got free.
Okay. I'm glad I had a sip of whiskey before I started talking. So really quick in response to her speech, and I thought up a lot about it, about times where I've disappeared, times where I've gotten quiet. Um, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but I want to remind everybody that it's not always your season to disappear. Sometimes it's your season to take up a whole lot of fucking space. Sometimes it's your season to be loud. Sometimes it's your season to be seen and open doors so other people can be seen. Um, we are in an age where we hear a lot of things coming at us, and everything is not for you. And if it is, embrace it. But if it's not, it's okay to let that pass on for someone else. This is not my season to take step back. This is not my season for silence. This is not my season for quiet. I've already done that. This is a different season for me. So, Fist and Fire origin story, how I got here. I am originally from Los Angeles. I'm the daughter of a Mexican immigrant. My mother immigrated from Sinaloa when she was 15, and met my father, who was originally from New Orleans. So I like to call myself Blaxican because back in the day when people were asking me what I was in the early 90s, there was no Afro-Latina. There wasn't a mixed, there wasn't multiple boxes to check on anything. There wasn't mixed race, biracial. There wasn't a place where you could put down a different race and a different ethnicity. There was none of that. It wasn't even available in the census. So that's what I came up with. So I grew up in LA, went to college in New Orleans, spent a horrible year in Indianapolis, and that's how I ended up running to Chicago to find people that didn't all have the same haircut and weren't all asking to speak to someone's manager. But this book is I know it sounds really crazy, but it's my life's work. I've always wrote poetry. I think the first time I wrote and performed anything, I was 6. I was the only biracial girl in an all-Black elementary school, and was teased a lot and retreated a lot into reading. So I would read by myself alone at lunch and by myself alone at recess. And then something clicked that I can write too. I want to just write when I want to read. And it didn't seem that revolutionary then, and I guess it is now. And so that's how I have spent all of my life expressing and thinking, was just always writing. And in high school, got a lot of support. But when I got to college, it there was a blossoming that happened. It was also during the time right before Love Jones came out. And it was this really great time for poetry. It was a really great time for culture and identity. Like the fact that we have teenagers who can so readily speak to what their identity is because of the work that we did in the 90s. All the work of breaking things down, of, just chopping it all up and going, is this what I really want to take from it? Is this what I want to wear? Is this what it's really about? Challenging those thoughts and ideas. And so just writing and performing and reading other people and having some really awesome moments. I think the biggest thing that touched me was we had a writer's workshop with 3 writers, Percival Everett, Troy Darracott, and Lucille Clifton. And because Xavier was such a small school, and it's a historically Black university that really focuses on putting Blacks in med school, our English department was 40 people. It was tiny. Like sometimes my classes maybe had 8 people in it, which was awesome because it was super intimate. So the writer's workshop, I got to sit like with these greats and read my work and poured into me. And it was something that I cherish. And Lucille is my person. She is the person who first told me it was okay to write my truth, no matter how ugly and scary it was, no matter how much it broke your heart while you wrote it. And I think she shaped my work the most. So then after college, I got here to Chicago after the year. We don't want to remember in Indy. Got to Chicago and met more of my tribe, and was married for 10 years. And I have 3 kids from that marriage. And it was a marriage filled with domestic violence and emotional and verbal abuse. And I stopped writing for 10 years. That was my quiet time. That was the time where I learned this talent that so many Black and brown women know how to do really well, is how to be small, how to be tiny for your safety, for your kids' safety. So that was my time for that. And the other side of it has been such a time of still trauma and unlearning and healing, but of such tremendous growth. And I'm so proud of myself. Like, I think we say that about each other so much. I'm so proud of you, girl. I'm proud of me. Like, I'm having my Snoop Dogg moment. Was it Snoop who did the award show? I was like, I would like to thank myself for all the hard work I've done and for not giving up on myself and being here for myself. I've had an amazing village here, a family that the universe has given me to replace sometimes, some toxic family members. I think Black and brown people are often taught we can't walk away from our family. That's your cousin, that's your aunt. Who cares if he's molesting people? Who cares if they're beating on you? That's your Theo. That's just how Uncle so-and-so is. Make sure your daughter puts on long pants. Like, we're taught that. And I think I've done a good job at teaching my kids that is not who we are. So just like you can walk away from a toxic job and toxic friends, there are toxic family members that you have to walk away from too, which leaves space for amazing people to fill that up. So I have an amazing village of friends and sister friends and brothers that have gotten me here today. And so that's how we birthed a book. Like, it was all of that time. It really started on social media and posting on social media and being amazed that anybody wanted to read a poem on Facebook. What? And I've been on this amazing wave of writing what I feel about what's happening in the moment and being astonished that other people feel the same way I feel. Like, every time I get a message of someone saying, thank you for writing what I couldn't put to words, or thank you for saying what I couldn't say, I'm like blown away. And it even in humanity's ugliest moments, and we've had so many ugly moments over the past 5 years, it's the one thing that I can hold on to, that there are still people out there who want to see it look differently and who are still deeply pained when we see examples of how it shouldn't be. Did I answer the question? Is this?
You asked, and I want to jump on a part that you said about clearing space, and then the right people show up and the right things show up. And you said sisters and sister friends, and it's a perfect segue for me to ask Lydia, a new sister friend in this group that we have. In hearing that, I'd love to understand your journey as a writer and a reader, and how early experiences that you may have had, college, beforehand, have shaped how the power of language has impacted your life.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. And thank you. I think I told you all that, it's an honor for me to be here with you all. And Leslé, when you write that words help you remember, that's what really speaks to me and spoke to me. So I've always been a reader and a writer. in grammar school, I think at some point we're going to talk about it, but in grammar school, we were told to read a poem by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, Hombres Necios. And that's a poem that has stuck with me I wrote it out in index cards posted on the outside of my bedroom door. It's still there. There's two things still on my bedroom door, a River Phoenix poster and that poem, right? And my parents just left it there. They're like, yeah, she's gonna do what she's gonna do, right? But so I've always been a reader, and I've always been a writer, and I used to sit my brothers down while I read them my poetry, and they humored me, and they thought everything I wrote was amazing, right? So, but then, college happened. And all of a sudden, for the first time, in grammar school and high school, the teachers I had, the educators I had, my family were always supportive. But college happened, and all of a sudden I was told that I wasn't a good writer. And not explicitly in those words, but very much in that sentiment. And so I think that when you're talking about making yourself small, I think that that's when it first started, right? So college. Then I went to my master's program, and that was a whole nightmare. So you're talking about running away from Indiana. I ran away from Kingston, Rhode Island as fast as I could, and I came back home. So I'm born and raised from Chicago. I came back home to my family, to my friends, to my community, where I knew that I could survive and live, right? Because I was literally dying, well, metaphorically dying, but literally as well, right? Because these things sort of attack you and you carry them with you. And then, you're talking about, this is your moment, right? Something happened during the pandemic for me. And I know that the pandemic has been horrible. I know that it's been tough on a lot of us, but something happened where it was just like, no, I need to write this. This is what I need to be writing. And this is what I need to get out there. I think part of it was being able to step away from, ironically, or maybe not so ironically, maybe a lot of us enter academia because it's been so toxic for us, as a means to sort of allow one safe space for our students, for our community who are in the classroom, to see themselves, but also to sort of honor who they are, their spirit, their words in the classroom itself. I don't know that I always succeed, but I always try really hard for that. And so during the pandemic, a lot of things happened. I got really sick, and I ended up having a hysterectomy, which for me was a blessing. Finally, my biology and my mind met as one. And that's a story that I wanted to write, because I think oftentimes, especially, both of my parents are Guatemalan. And I think that as Latinas, a hysterectomy could be the worst thing in the world for you. And we know historically how hysterectomies have been used on women of color. But for me, it was everything I've always wanted. Like, I have no ties to my uterus. I have no ties to ever wanting to be a mother. And so when my body was breaking down and my doctor said, this is what you need, it was like my mind and body finally met, and I felt free. And so that's something that I've been writing and exploring. And I think that opened up space to sort of think about what else I wanted to write. So I write academically, right? So I write about linguistic rights, language access, bilingual education. But creatively, what I'm interested in writing about is exactly what you say, how words help us remember the things that we didn't even know we forgot because of history, because of, a border, because of generational separation. And that's what I've been interested in, sort of jumping in and sort of thinking about the ways in which we can reclaim, remember something that for us, like in our body, is there, historically is there, but it's been removed because of time, because of, where we just happen to be born and things like that. But so I'm reclaiming everything, and I'm throwing it all out there, whether it gets rejected or not, that's not the point. I'm reclaiming and I'm just enjoying it. So you're saying, this is my time, and I'm writing it. Yeah.
Beautiful. Idalmi, I would love to call you into the conversation. We have our feminist foremothers to thank for understanding that we experience politics in very personal ways, and that the personal is political and the political is personal. And I would love to hear from you about the relationship between culture, writing, and identity, and culture and place for you as a writer and as a reader.
Isis, thank you so much for first the invitation, because I've told you all, but I want to say it kind of publicly. I'm like thrilled to know you and be in conversation with all of you tonight. And I really appreciate that question about culture and place and how writing kind of helps me get connected to those things, but also helps me figure it out. I grew up on the west coast of Puerto Rico. My first language is Spanish. But being Puerto Rican and all the things that colonialism mean, and also from the first grade in Puerto Rico, I went to an English immersion school. So all of my classes were in English except Spanish class. And I had excellent Spanish teachers from the first grade, because they knew, they're like, if you're going to learn Spanish, it's me, right? I am the person who's going to teach it to you. So Spanish classes were always the hardest, which I'm very grateful for, but it always meant that the outside of Spanish class, like all the written culture I like consumed was like Sweet Valley Twins and Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley High and MTV and right, like all of those things. So from a very young age, I've had to kind of like navigate what culture means in terms of language. And like Leslé said, like I too was like a kid who was like lost in books as a very, very young person. And that quickly in my mind meant, well, this is what I want to do. I want to tell stories. I want to write stories. But outside of the very serious Spanish language novels that we read in class, like writing meant like fun stories that were written in English, right? Like, and it took me a long time to be comfortable being creative in terms of my creative practice in Spanish. And to this day, I still, even my short stories and my fiction, if I'm thinking of a project, my go-to is, of course, I'm going to write that in English. And some things are meant to be written in Spanish, but that needs, for me, that's like a very conscious switch that I need to think about and convince myself of. And it took a long time for me to even feel comfortable that like I could write a full story in Spanish that would be good enough to like share publicly, that readers would want to read, even though Spanish was my first language. And those are, there are still moments where I struggle with that. It's like, okay, this is the thing I want to say. What is the place where I feel I need to place it? And then in what language do I want to tell that story? And it's kind of a day-to-day, project-to-project decision, because as a Latina who now at this point I've lived most of my life in the contiguous 48 states. And culturally, what does that mean, right? Like, if I were going to write a story for television, where do I want that show to air, right? Like, is that an Univision show or like an NBC show? Or like, is it bilingual and does it live in Netflix? I don't know. Those are big questions, but it's like, for me, being Puerto Rican means all of those things. And sometimes if I'm in Puerto Rico for 2 weeks, all I've spoken is Spanish, and like my accent becomes very apparent and I'm swallowing all my S's and all my D's, and that's right, like what happens. But then I'm in Chicago and all of a sudden I have a work call with Spanish speakers, and that's like the proper Spanish when I'm enunciating, right? And like all of those versions of culture and all of those versions of language live within me. And it's like, what is the part of me that like I'm going to bring to a particular moment? And that's true like in life, and it's also true in like a creative practice.
Thank you. I my texts are popping as we're sitting here, and people are saying read, read, read. So Leslé, would you honor us with selecting something that you feel like is either fitting for tonight or fitting for this being your season?
First, I'm going to unmute. That's the first thing to do. And I want to do two pieces, but they're short and they go together. So one was Lydia said this was her favorite from the book, and it's so appropriate to go with the conversation that we're having right now. So it's in my book. This is my book. It's my butt on my book. David painted it. Those are my books too. And it's called Cultural Bankruptcy. En el nombre del Padre, del Hijo, del Espíritu Santo. Sometimes immigrants wash culture off their seeds, an uprooting, a transplanting from fields of agave to terracotta pots. Because Gringolandia requires sacrifices. The price of entry is sometimes paid in native tongues, ripped from your mouth like weeds from the garden of America. Assimilation for a green card, appropriation, the price for citizenship, a whitening of flesh and sinew, spirit and soul. Uncle Sam's fees for freedom surge if you are Black and brown. So sometimes immigrants try to protect by giving names that don't sound accented, by making English the only instead of an addition. Sometimes immigrants fight a lifetime, para el norte, only to find hate as payment for hard work, bigotry as payment for integrity, the death of culture in children as payment for protection, as payment for do better than me, as payment for hope. And the children wander, lost, dancing between a land that is memory and a land that wants them on the other side of a wall. And in just a sister to that piece is a piece that I wrote last year for my daughter. And my daughter's a painter. And she's finishing up her last year in Baltimore, and she has started to write. She fought really hard to get into a creative writing class, and it's blowing me away because I'm like, how can you paint and write? Like, I have the jealous, like, oh, you're so great. But she's writing about being a brown-skinned girl who presents to the world as Black, but is also Latina and very proud of her heritage. I'm first generation. It's nothing that we've ever hidden, but in our communities, colorism is huge, and Black hate is huge. It's like the first gift that any immigrant is given. As soon as they come to America, we are taught how to hate Black people. And so that really is difficult when you are all of those things at once. So last year during the pandemic for Mexican Independence Day, we drove down 26th Street and it was awesome. And it was just great because she wouldn't have been home typically, she would have been at school. And so this was written after that amazing evening. My daughter says to me, why is Latinidad always Selena and never Celia? My daughter with cinnamon skin and an ocean of Black hair falling down her shoulders to her waist like midnight curls. My daughter says to me as we walk into our favorite restaurant, why do they always speak to you in Spanish and me in English while we are seated at the same table? My daughter says to me, what does it feel like to be accepted? To never have anyone question when you say you are Mexican? What does it feel like to belong to a people who belong to you and wear pride without explanation? My daughter presses me, challenges me to see her the way the world sees her, Black first, woman next, Latina never. And I, with empty hands, heartbreaking, can only answer, it's not your skin or your language or the miles that separate you from our home that makes you. It's sangre y hueso, your lineage, your mother's mother's mother, Mother Earth, reaching, stretching back before explorers and colonization and slavery and white skin. It's more than the traditions, the assimilation, hopes we forget. It's the soul of you, the heart of you, the dance in your smile, your abuelita's joy. And my daughter says to me, that is still not enough. When I can only peer through the windows, stand on the sidewalk, smell the air, and never be invited in. We drive down 26th Street and wave our bandera, scream viva into the night, honk our horns, laugh at the Trump piñatas, smile at the children on top of cars. And my daughter says, we are so beautiful. And it makes me a little sad. So couldn't have this conversation during this time of year and not talk about how we show up as Latina people and all of the different parts of us. And sometimes those parts and those influences echo in how we exclude, how we unpack language, how we quantify if someone is Latino enough, if they speak a language that's not even ours. Spanish isn't even our language. Like, we've been using it for a long time, but that's not what we spoke before other people got to our places. So it's I'm also very honored to be in spaces to talk to other Latina women, because in my 20 years of writing and in my last decade of doing so publicly, it has only been within the last 2 years that I've been invited to speak in Latinx spaces. And I always lead with, I'm both and proud of both and talk about both. But it's only been within the past 2 years that I have been invited to speak and to present and to read in spaces that are primarily Latino. And I'm excited and thrilled. And also I go, why did it take so long for this acceptance to happen, for the other part of me to be allowed to speak loudly to my heritage, my people, my connection. So yeah, just wanted to offer that up.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you to connect what you were just saying about entering a community you've always been a part of and this level of embrace. And I'd love to hear from all of you as creatives, as academics, as folks who professionally are writing, to talk to me about the creative communities that you're a part of in Chicago or beyond, and what it is that they do to fill you or fill your craft.
So I'm not part of a creative writing community. So my writing community is very much academic, right? So we sort of hold each other up, a community of mostly women of color who hold one another up. But the creative community that I think has allowed me space to think about the writing process is sort of the textile community. I think I told all of you in a previous conversation that I'm also interested in rejection. I kind of don't mind rejection, and the drafting process, the words that get us to the final product, right? How our final products stand on those initial words, but we discard them. And so one of the things that I've been playing with, and this is why I like Cecilia Vicuña's work, is because sort of thinking about the ways in which we can perform or have a visual representation of what those words are. And so I think the textile community has allowed me to think about those discarded drafts and how to sort of embrace them and have space for them, because they got me to that final version, that final draft. And I am curious about sort of everyone here, the writing process, and sort of thinking about that first initial draft and then sort of allowing it to grow into that final draft, and how that process happens for you all.
I definitely want to talk about like creative communities in Chicago because I think I write because Chicago ended up being the city that I moved to almost 20 years ago. Although that was always an aspiration, it took coming here to know how people write, right? Like how people make a life and make a creative practice. Because when I went to college writing, like I wasn't a creative writing major, right? Like you don't go to college to write, you go to college to get a profession that can like set you up for life, and writing isn't that. And then I came to Chicago in my early 20s, not really knowing anyone here. And my first community, period, like the first group of people that I connected with were Latina writers. And there was a reading series, writing circle called Proyecto Latina. And we met on Mondays, and it was like Diana Pando and Iracema Gonzalez and Amanda Torres and Nina Sanchez and Koya Paz. And that's how like we shared work, right? And we read in front of each other. And 2 decades later, not all of those people are like writers, but all of those people have creative practices and have ended up being kind of part of the reach culture of Chicago, because then they serve in many different ways, kind of like the creative communities of our city. And that was a first taste of what it means to be a creative person in Chicago. But that was it. That was the first taste, right? Then you come in and then you meet people, you understand how everyone is so collaborative in this town, how you can share work and you can share first ugly drafts and have people you trust to share that work with, and trust what they're telling you of what they find in that work or what they don't, or to ask you the question that gets you to the next slightly better version of that draft. But I don't know how I would have found a way into those processes without the generous artist of Chicago.
A mí me toca. I don't do a lot of drafts. So my poetry, specifically the poetry that I share publicly, I call it like live tweeting. It's like live poetry, and it lives in a space that is definitely not academic, and it is also not slam poetry. It's meant to be either read yourself or read someone to read it to you. And it's difficult for me to sometimes find performance pieces. And when I do, I'm like, oh, this is dope, because they're not all supposed to be like that. And I'm okay with that. Like I spent years trying to figure out, I don't know. And I did study writing. My degree's in English Lit and I minored in Spanish. Trying to figure out like, how do I do it in a way that's journal worthy or poetry foundation worthy? How do I get into that space? And it's not authentic to me, the same way as slam poetry is not authentic to me. And some of my thinking behind that is it's probably very colonized, that it doesn't mean anything if it's not written down on paper, if it's not where someone else can find it. When you just say it, it just floats into the air. And that's not true, because it floats into our souls and into our beings. But very much in that space. And so a lot of my influences and support have come from non-writers, but other creatives. So painters and photographers and dancers and musicians. And I mean, anything where you are creating something that's specific to your soul's voice, not specific to anything else. That is who I the past 24 years in Chicago, I have found myself being lucky to be surrounded by. So yeah, there's not a lot of, it's not a lot of planning. Typically I'm writing about something that is happening with immediacy. Sometimes I'm writing about it as it's happening. Like when I did the poem about Meghan Markle, I was writing it during watching the Oprah interview, and I just waited to the next morning to post it. The poem I did about Serena. And so these are some of the poems that I've had that have gone like really, really viral, that have gotten me like media coverage, stuff I never dreamed poetry would do. When I'm writing about it, I try to capture it at the moment, like immediately after Serena lost the bout, and everybody was, making caricatures of her looking like a monkey, and talking about her having bad behavior. And it's the same behavior we see male tennis players have. I wrote about it at that moment. I wrote about Meghan Markle's mom, Doria, like watching her in the car going to the wedding. And so that's the spot that I realize is what I do. And it is not for me to censor. It is for me just to write what I'm feeling at the moment as it's happening, and to be able to record that, because I think we make records of things that erase the humanity of it. We talk about, death, like even most recently, we talk about George Floyd and all of the upheaval that happened afterwards. But we talk about it, sometimes we get so far away about why that was happening and what we were feeling, that feeling of grief, that feeling of fear, that feeling of powerlessness, that feeling of anger, that feeling of just being done with it, the crippling moment of hearing him call out for his mother. Those were the feelings that fed us to then do action. And so I want to capture that feeling without it going too far into me overthinking, did I phrase something right? Or, should I find a rhyming pattern for this? So I'll send it to people that I trust to check my spelling, because I'm a horrible, awful, terrible speller. And typically with poetry, I don't have to worry about grammar, because I'm like, that's not my thing either. Like, I do poetry because I have so much more control over it and I don't have to think about rules. So that's how the writing happens. There probably should be a lot more editing. I would probably piss less people off if I did.
Can I say, like, and I think I've told you this before, but I think that's what the sort of the honest, vulnerable, you're speaking to me directly comes from, right? From your poetry, because it does feel like you were sitting there in front of me and as I'm reading, that we're talking, right? So this conversation, it's not conversational, but it's this sort of this private, for lack of a better word, conversation that we're having as author to reader, going into your book.
Thank you. That I could just cry. That means a ton. Like, that's all you ever want to hear, is that it's authentic to someone other than yourself. Because if not, you can just keep your journal. you never have to share it. Just put it on your bedside.
So I want to turn our attention, because we've got folks writing in the chat, and there is a question from Nathan, and I'm going to read it, Leslé. It's for you. And this is from your reading. The blood and bone line. How did you formulate it, and why did it find itself as Spanish on the page? Curious to your thought process.
I know this is going to sound like a really corny, like artisty answer. It just came. Like, I was just really, really sad. We came home after having this great day, and because all of my Mexican family is still in Mexico, except for my mom and my brother, who are in LA. So we're lucky that Chicago has so many places where we can celebrate and be immersed in it. And sometimes I forget that my immersion comes very easily. And two of my children who are lighter in complexion, their immersion comes very easily. Nobody questions them. I think their assumption is probably that they're either Puerto Rican or some other Afro-Latina. But for my daughter, who's just the most gorgeous shade of brown, she gets it, and it hurts a lot. And first, to be reminded as a parent that I have forgotten the pain points of my child is like, oh, stab in the gut. But then to see things through her eyes. So this beautiful moment that I thought we were having of celebration, and just I've written about how the whole the whole concept of Mexican independence, how it began with a speech and words and inspiration, and as a writer, how that ties to me so powerfully. To have the conversation with my daughter, just to be reminded how difficult sometimes it is for her, how difficult it is to love something about yourself so tremendously, and people not accept that you are allowed to do that. So it just comes. Like, I didn't say, oh, I want to write a poem about this. It just comes. And the line for Sangre y Hueso, that just came. Spanish was also my first language. But I grew up in a household with no one spoke it except my grandmother and I. My mom was very much the immigrant who was like, you're going to speak English, because she felt insecure about her accent and people questioning her. And so it ebbs and flows when it wants to. Mainly my writing is in English, but when it presents itself and the Spanish wants to come out, I just let it. And sometimes my conjugations suck. And sometimes I'm like, can somebody look at this? And sometimes I'm like, nope, you're gonna get my Spanglish. I know what I meant, and you know what I meant too. And I try not to let perfectionism bother me about my language. And then I go back to the space like, that's not my language anyway. So that's how it happened, Nathan. I wish there was a better answer, but that was the truth.
So we have two more questions, one for Idalmi and one for Lydia. These are in the chat. Idalmi from Fabi, how are you reinvesting the positive creative energies invested in you? And Lydia, how are you enabling young minds to be free and use words to challenge the system, institutions, tradition, expectations toward us Latinas? Good questions, Fabi.
Fabi, thank you for those questions. So I want to say that Fabiola and the work she does as like a cultural programmer in the city are like a huge model and inspiration for me. And I appreciate that question, Fabi, because going back to the beginning of our conversation where we were talking about, moments to like take up space and shine and be out there, and moments to like perhaps withdraw. I think I am also just coming into a moment where I am recommitting to my own creative practice. For a long time, for almost a decade, my primary work has been creating events, right? Like making opportunities for writers, mostly poets, to do their thing, either in ways that support their private practices or in ways that like puts that art out into the world. And that was a place of a lot of satisfaction and pride for me. But it also was a place of comfort, and it was a place where I could like take a back step in my own creative practice and not have to write and then put my work out there. And it got to the point where that wasn't enough for me, which is why then I was like, okay, well, you really haven't written regularly in a long time. You haven't thought about stories. You haven't committed and nurtured that part of yourself. And I am in that process of coming out, because I do think that a lot of my energy in recent years has gone to like reinvesting into those communities who have supported and inspired and comforted and make me continue creating. But I want some of that work now to be kind of more public and out in the world, my own work. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, Fabi. I don't know. It's such a difficult question. I echo, I absolutely, Fabi, you know how I feel about you. But all right, the question. How do I enable young minds to be free and use words to challenge the system, institution, tradition, expectations towards us Latinas? I think that, that's sort of complicated in many levels. And I think it sort of works towards sort of the complication that a lot of us educators have being in the classroom and sort of having to, balance sort of wanting students to sort of write, and then, but also having these institutional expectations. I think one of the things that I tell my students, there's several things, like, you know, I tell my students, Cole said it just recently at the Emmys, like you read before, but Gloria Anzaldúa, put your shit on paper, right? I don't know, we can swear, sorry. But, you know, and that's what I tell my students, just write it down, just write it down. What are you doing? What are you feeling? What do you want to say? Forget about the, you know, sort of the structures, the constructs that sort of imprison us and sort of stop us from writing. And I think that that's one of the things that, that's one of the things that sort of paralyzed me from writing for such a long time, is folks telling me that I couldn't write. And so just recently, a student told me that high school broke him. And I hear that. And so a lot of times when students are in my classroom, they're coming straight from high school where somebody broke them. And so they hate writing, they hate English. And sort of, I see it as my job. I'm not Robin Williams jumping on a table, you know, ripping books up. I'm under no illusion that I'm going to be sort of dangerous minding them, right? But I am sort of I'm hoping that I'm allowing the space for students to sort of tap into the kind of writing they want to do, to be able to communicate what they want to say in the way they want to say it. And then, you know, sort of walking them through, and sort of this idea of dialogue. I think, you know, sometimes writing, it's the finished product and there's no dialogue whatsoever. And it's no dialogue about what was your intention. Let me talk to you about intention. Here's what I understood. Is that what you intended? You know, and I think that that's sort of what I bring to the table with students, is let's talk about what you wrote, what I understood, and that messiness in between, if there's messiness in between. But what Captain. But what I'm hoping is that, you know, my students feel safe enough to take chances. You know, in academia seems to be the only space where making a mistake, making an error docks you points, as opposed to, we need to make those mistakes if we can call them mistakes, if we should call them mistakes. We need to make those errors if we should call them errors in order to grow. How else are we supposed to grow? We're not allowed to take chances. And there's some students who look a specific way, who are allowed to take chances and creative freedom in a ways that a lot of our students who look a certain way, who have a certain name, are not. And so this is one of the things that I tell my students, take the chance. In my class, take the chance. There's no penalty for taking those chances. And in terms of challenging, I think that by this in front of the classroom challenges a lot of notions for a lot of people. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a complicated question, one that I go back and forth and wrestle with all the time.
Thank you. Leslé, before you answer Fabi's question, which is another fantastic question, can you tell folks what's coming next for you? We're all voracious readers, I'm sure, on here, and ready to read something else. So let us know how we can.
The next thing for me has been a gift from the pandemic. So never in my wildest dreams did I think I would ever get a literary agent or be published by a major publishing house. And there was a poem in Fist and Fire called Brown Girl. And when Vice President Harris won, I was thinking about what to write, and that's what bubbled up. And I was like, I don't have to write anything new. And I tweaked it a little bit and it went crazy viral. And I had someone from Writers House reach out to me, Joanna Castillo, who's now my literary agent. And Writers House like represents MLK and Octavia Butler, and Joanna also represents Isabel Allende. So it was just blew my mind. That is now my agent. And Brown Girl will be a children's book in early 2023, published by Little Brown, which is an imprint of Hatchet. Cosby Cabrera is doing the illustrations, which is absolutely phenomenally beautiful. Like I just cried, and just the way that the stars aligned when I got the first pagination with her art on it was on my daughter's 21st birthday. And it was just all the crying and the snot and everything. And then that will be followed by Brown Boy, which will be illustrated by my bestie, David Anthony Geary, who did the cover of my poetry book, Fist and Fire. So those are the two things that will come out like immediately. Letters in Lanyap, which is the follow-up to Fist and Fire, we are still working on. And this is the hard part, editing, like what to include, what not to include. It's a lot of work over the past couple of years. Trump gave me a lot of stuff to write about. So those are the things that I have coming up with immediacy. I am always on social media. I haven't learned how to do TikTok, but you can, I don't know if I can. You can always find my stuff on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter will be linked to Instagram because I talk too much for Twitter. So that is, it's just not a good platform for me. So there's always, it just links you to somewhere else. But to Fabiola's question, first, don't challenge them to use Spanish. If that's not how they want to communicate, then they don't have to communicate using Espanol. If that's not what they want to use, they need to have the freedom to use it, and it makes them no less anything to choose to speak in another language, English or Spanglish or any derivative of that. I don't see how they having you as an aunt, how can they not step into the wholeness of themselves? They have such an amazing example of strength and power and fearlessness, and someone who builds community and wraps her arms around people and makes space. Like, how can they not follow in that path? They will get there. They got you.
That's a beautiful last thought. But before we go, Lydia and Idalmi and Leslé, is there anything that the audience didn't ask, that I didn't ask, that you want to say while we're all together? The floor is yours.
Thank you all. Thank you all for having me and for listening.
For
And
sure.
for allowing me to have a conversation with Leslé and Idalmi.
If this is your jam, and I'm imagining folks who are still with us, this is your jam. APL is not into performative diversity. This is really who we are. So come back. We're almost going to be ready to be in person. We've been away, and we are about exchange. We are about gathering. We are about assembly and about community. So this has been a hard almost 2 years for us, but in October, we are back. So if this is what you like, we've got so much more to share with you. And so I hope folks can return, and I just want to say thank you. Everybody was at work today. Everybody raced home to do this. And so I'm eternally thankful to you all. And again, thanks to Fabi for putting this together and making us all friends in the way that you do.
Because we're besties now.
Besties now. So thank you.
Thank you. This was fantastic.